You're listening to Civic from the San Francisco Public Press. The U.S. news media broadly is under attack by a leader who calls journalists the enemy of the people. But the destruction of local newspapers has been underway for years, with hedge fund owners buying up publications, laying off staff, and selling valuable assets, usually real estate, for a quick profit.
It wasn't just, the internet's taking, readers away and maybe the advertising dollars are different and something like that. No, there's corporate greed that is wrecking journalism in city after city.
We'll talk with Rick Goldsmith to explore this topic and discuss his documentary, Stripped for Parts, American Journalism on the Brink. I'm Lila LaHood, and this is Civic.
Tomorrow will be the final edition of the Rocky Mountain News.
For the last decade and a half, we've seen 1,800 newspapers disappear.
The Denver Post isn't dying. Alden Capital is murdering the Denver Post, and not only the Post, but papers from coast to coast.
I think we're facing an immense national tragedy if these newspapers go under.
They saddle the business with debt, they pay themselves first, then they strip them for their parts.
There are times in your life when you are thrust into a situation where are you going to stand up and risk everything, or are you going to back down?
The journalists themselves have finally realized if we don't tell this story, who's going to tell it?
Newspapers are not just any other business. They are the only private industry specifically named in the Bill of Rights.
People need to know there's a problem, and they need to know why it's happening.
History will not judge us kindly if one day we wake up to realize we failed to protect our community's right to know, and in turn, our very democracy.
So, Rick, I'm delighted to be speaking with you about your latest documentary, Stripped for Parts, American Journalism on the Brink. So thank you so much for being here today.
It's great to be here, and I love talking about the film.
You've had a long career in documentary film, and two of your films have been nominated for Academy Awards. Tell the Truth and Run, George Seldes and the American Press, which you produced and directed, and The Most Dangerous Man in America, Daniel Ellsberg and the Pentagon Papers, which you co-produced and co-directed with Judith Ehrlich. This is an amazing record, and, the film that we're going to be talking about today, this isn't even your first time tackling journalism as a topic. How did you decide to tell this particular story?
Well, this particular story, I've been reading newspapers since I was 7 years old, and I've always loved journalism and loved journalists. And this particular, how this particular film came to me was reading an article that said something like Alden Global Capital is making so much money wrecking local journalism, it might not want to stop anytime soon. Mm. And to me, that triggered three big questions. One is, why would an outfit make money wrecking local journalism rather than practicing it? And two, newspapers were such a failing business. We all knew that.
Right.
How could they make money from a failing business? But three, the thing that really captivated me was the journalists. I mean, journalists go by almost a reverential axiom. You don't write about yourselves. You don't talk about yourselves. And here was something that was in the lap of their profession, their industry. And they were not only writing about it, but they were taking action. They were becoming activists, and they were becoming the news themselves. And to me, having a group of people standing up for themselves, but more importantly, really standing up for the rest of us, because their journalist is serving us. That, to me, was just ripe for, it was just a delicious topic to get into.
And where were we in the timeline at that point? And actually, perhaps I should ask you first to maybe give a little bit of an overview for people. I mean, we don't want to give away the whole film, but we know there was a lot going in Denver and in other parts of the country. At when was the point when you started doing your research and started filming interviews with people?
The journalists in Denver, at the Denver Post particularly, they there was an editorial that was written in the Denver Post that kind of blasted their hedge fund owner, and that made national news within days and weeks. And that's where I saw this first article about Alden Global Capital making so much money wrecking local journalism. That was in the spring of 2018. And from that point on, I thought I had a kind of neat story tied up, that I could tie up with a bow of what had happened in Denver. And little did I know, this was only the beginning of the story. And it unfolded in 2019 somewhere else, and in 2020 somewhere else. And I followed it, it turns out, for 5 years until I followed it for 5 years and finally felt that I had the end of the story and I needed to wrap it up and I needed it to get it out to the public and tell the tale.
I want to ask you to tell us a little bit about Julie Reynolds, who ends up being sort of a featured character in your story. She's an investigative reporter and one of the co-founder of Voices of Monterey Bay here in the Bay Area, which is a nonprofit news organization. And she figures quite prominently in the story. Can you tell us about how you connected with her and why she serves so well as a guide for what's happening?
When I first found out the story of what was happening in Denver, it was very easy for me to kind of trace. I would just talk to one person, I talked to another person, and immediately I had 6 to 10 people who were major major players in the story. And one of them, who was not based in Denver, was Julie Reynolds. And she had been working on a series, an investigative series for the union, really, the News Guild, about Alden Global Capital. She had been working for an Alden paper, Alden-owned paper, the Monterey County Herald. And they were taken over about 2010, the same time that the Denver Post was taken over by Alden Global Capital. And she saw things go rapidly downhill and finally took a buyout. And the union came to her and said, why don't you do something on Alden Global Capital? Together they figured, oh, I'm an investigative reporter, said Julie. Why don't I just investigate Alden Global Capital? She had been doing it for 2 years by the time I got onto the film.
Mm-hmm.
And so she was the perfect person to take us through not only what had happened up until that point in 2018, but what was about to happen for the next several years.
And as you saw what was unfolding from paper to paper and city to city with Alden Global Capital, at a certain point, did you feel like you knew exactly where things were heading with the story, or did things evolve along the way?
Oh, absolutely not. I absolutely did not know where they were heading. In fact, I was taking a short vacation in Oaxaca with my wife in January of 2019, which is about 8 months after I'd gotten into the film. And I found out that Alden Global Capital was going over the largest publicly owned chain of newspapers in America, the Gannett chain.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, okay, we have to wrap up this vacation. No, we played out the vacation for a week. But as soon as I got back into town, I was on another major part of the story. And then as that thing wrapped up, more things were happening in the Tribune Company, especially the Chicago Tribune and the Baltimore Sun. So there was yet more to follow. And what I didn't know in each event was Alden going to be successful in taking over these other entities, or were the journalists going to be able to successfully fight back?
It's interesting. You mentioned Baltimore, and that story in particular I found very interesting because there was a moment when it seemed that one set of, good billionaires might come in and save the day. And you sort of think, and I remember when this was happening in real time, and you think, is it, good billionaires versus bad billionaires? Or at the end of the day, and it turned out that deal didn't go through. What did you think when you saw that happening?
It was interesting to see that the people in the Chicago Tribune, the reporters in the Chicago Tribune, were looking for billionaires to take over that paper so that Alden wouldn't take it over. And then the same thing happened in Baltimore. They were looking for billionaires to take over. And it looked at one point as if the billionaires would be successful. As it turned out, that they weren't as successful as people would have liked them to be. And there's even a line in the film that said something like, perhaps it's folly to think that we could put our trust in billionaires saving us from the demise of newspapers. Well, little did we know, I mean, this film was finished in 2023. Little did we know that come the election season here, a billionaire in Los Angeles, Patrick Soon-Shiong, and a billionaire that owned the Washington Post, Jeff Bezos, were caving in to the most powerful politician in the country, and doing exactly what newspapers shouldn't be doing. They should be going after abuse of power. And I think that's what shows us what can happen when we put our faith in the rich and powerful, who tend to have been the publishers all throughout our history. There's a price that we pay for that.
And you're talking about what happened in this past election when the publishers stepped in and told the editorial boards that they didn't want presidential endorsements. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Yeah.
And this was after the editorial boards, known to be very independent from the publishers, had already done their endorsements, and they were prevented from doing so. And at both newspapers, you had major editors and writers quitting the newspaper in protest from what their publishers had done.
A brief note. On February 26th, shortly after this interview, Jeff Bezos, owner of the Washington Post, ordered the paper's opinion section to only publish op-eds about, quote, personal liberties and free markets, claiming that the Post no longer needs to offer perspectives on other topics since social media can now cover all views, adding that, quote, today the internet does that job. Editorial page editor David Shipley resigned in response. Now back to our interview with Rick Goldsmith about his documentary, Stripped for Parts, American Journalism on the Brink. When we talk about what journalists can do to fight back, I mean, you're right. Quitting in protest is one thing. But tell me about some of the things that you saw journalists doing.
In response to all the global capital, reporters and editors did a number of things, and they were different at every paper. One of the first things they did in Denver was through their union, and this was a union shop, and that's an important note. They went on the picket line, and they educated the public, first with an editorial in the newspaper, but then they went on picket lines in Denver. They went on picket lines in New York, which is where Alden Global Capital had their headquarters at the time. And by doing that, they threw the story open to the public. So the main thing that the newspaper men and women did was they educated the public on what was happening to their newspapers and how it wasn't just, the internet's taking, readers away, and maybe the advertising dollars are different and something like that. No, there's corporate greed that is wrecking journalism in city after city. So that was number one, what they did. Number two was they had to decide, were they going to stay with the paper or not stay with the paper? And some of that was not their choice. And I will make a very, very important distinction here between the newspapers that had union shops. So they had protection, and they could go on the picket line in Denver, go on the picket line in New York at the corporate headquarters of Alden Global Capital, and not have to worry that they were going to lose their job, as opposed to another newspaperman at the Boulder Daily Camera, only an hour's drive from the Denver Post, which was not a union shop. And he went on television and on the web, on the internet, blasting Alden Global Capital, and he got fired. because specifically he had no union protection. So that's an important distinction for people to know. Um, when you're working in just about any industry, for the newspaper men and women here, there are union shops and not union shops, and they're protected um, for their activism.
What was something surprising that you discovered in making this documentary?
Well, one of the things that was surprising was that when I first got into the story in the spring of 2018, the word among people who wrote about this, Julie Reynolds, Ken Doctor, and the people at the local press, the word was these hedge funds were going to go in there, they were going to run the newspapers to the ground, make their profits, and get out within 3 years. And that's not what happened.
Mm-hmm.
What they found was they not only could make money at the beginning, which was kind of their MO for taking over failing newspapers. You get in cheap, so you buy the property for cheap. You sell off the assets, the main asset being the downtown building where the newsroom was, and you cut the staff, maybe by a third. And already you've made your money back, and that's why I think people thought they were going to then get out and probably either sell the newspapers or close the newspapers. But what happened was they found that they could still make money from the running of newspapers. Part of that was because of the finances of the time. Part of it was because of COVID, a number of things. But Alden Global Capital is still one of the largest owners of newspapers in America, and they keep buying up newspapers, and they've sold very, very few of them.
And what is morale like at the papers that have survived, that continue to operate under Alden Global Capital ownership?
That's a great question about morale. One of the first things that happens when Alden Global Capital or another hedge fund that might have kind of the same MO takes over the newspaper, and that is morale goes down. Why does it go down? Because they tend to lay off the staff. They tend to be taken over. Alden Global Capital, which was based in New York when I got into the film, they're now based in Florida. They're not local owners. When you work for a paper that has a local publisher, no matter how much of a skinflint they might be, because the Denver Post's publisher, Dean Singleton, was known to be a skinflint, they're local.
Mm-hmm.
And you have a personal relationship, and you have a connection through the community from, the newest reporter up through the publisher. So the morale goes into the toilet because you feel like you're treated like just somebody that's bringing in bucks, not somebody who's telling the news of your community, the news and events of your community, and informing the public.
Yeah. Speaking of those personal connections, so I enjoyed watching this film for so many reasons. Obviously, I'm a journalist. I care about the future of journalism in this country. And I happen to know several of the journalists you interviewed. I know Tom Peel very well. He and I have both been involved with SPJ NorCal, which is the Northern California chapter of the Society of Professional Journalists. And then when you got into the world of nonprofit news organizations, that's my world. And there were so many people I recognized, ones you talked to and even people in the background. And I'm going somewhere with this. I do want to ask, what do you think of this expansion of the nonprofit news sector and the role of philanthropy in supporting local news ecosystems? As you delve into that area, what were your thoughts?
Well, I think you've hit on 2 points. They're related, but they're not the same. One is kind of local startups. Many of them are nonprofits, not all of them are, and the other is the role of philanthropy. So I'll take that. I'll take first the role of startups, many of them nonprofits that are just proliferating all around the country. At last count, there were probably over 500 nonprofits and other small, local, mostly digital news organizations. They are picking up the ball from the legacy newspapers because The legacy newspapers are being kind of run into the ground. They're not as hefty as they used to be. They're becoming kind of ghost newspapers, shadows of their former selves. And a second thing, what's happening with let's call them the nonprofits or the startups, is it's easier for them to really practice public service journalism. The old model of legacy newspapers was a compromised model. They were catering to advertisers. There was a certain amount of freedom in writing for those papers, but there was also a certain amount of censorship and suppression of news. And were they really covering all of the community? Well, they tended to cater to the upper middle class and sometimes to the local businesses, really very frankly to the local businesses. And they weren't covering communities of color, poor people, people in labor. And so with the introduction of more news organizations that are really coming from the community, maybe journalists who came from other newspapers and maybe community members who were active in their community, forming the heart and soul of those nonprofits, they tend to do more public service journalism. They tend to cover more of these previously uncovered communities, communities of color, labor, poor people, street people, homeless. And there's a certain way in which the community actually gets covered better, even if it's a smaller group of journalists.
I agree with you. And we've been longtime members of both the Institute for Nonprofit News, which represents, the nonprofit sector, but also Lion, which is the local independent online news publishers. And you see amazing work happening, on both sides. And in fact, there are a lot of organizations that overlap and consider them part of both of those communities. One thing I wanted to ask you about, I know you've attended screenings of the film around the country. What have the reactions been, both from journalists and from other community members?
It's been fascinating going around the country with this film. We've been to probably over 30, 35 separate communities, cities, small cities, some rural areas, and maybe 50 screenings. The response from journalists have been very heartwarming to me because they say, yeah, you really told that story and told it well and covered a lot of ground. And the response from the non-journalists who are in the community has likewise been very, very positive and very strong in the sense that we know that we're having problems in our community and we're addressing it in this way or in that way, but it's really hard. And your film is helping us kind of get the conversation advanced another couple of steps. And I think it's going to take that. It's good to hear that because that's why I did the film, to be able to advance the discussion, the public discussion about what's happening to journalism and particularly local journalism all around the country today.
It's interesting. We've been talking about local journalism, but I'd be curious to know what you think in light of what's happening with national politics. Where do you think journalists stand today? We've gone through a period where, we've been hearing for years that trust in news organizations has eroded, although it's always been a little bit better with local. But will that trend continue, or do you think we might see it reversed as fears about perhaps the federal government increase? And could that reframe the role of journalists and how they're seen sort of in the national consciousness?
Well, I think it's we are at a very important turning point in our country because along with the change in newspapers kind of failing and news deserts arising and ghost newspapers, now we have this political moment where the press is under attack politically like nothing before. And I think it's incumbent upon the more powerful and the national news organizations to fight back and to do simple things like, I still subscribe to the New York Times. I usually look at it on my phone. Inevitably, there's a picture of the president. There doesn't need to be a picture of the president. They're amplifying his message. They should be going after abuse of power. Their news stories can be all the same as they are writing now. But don't show endless pictures of the president. Likewise, NPR. It's a very, very strong network of news organizations around, both central NPR and then the satellite news organizations. And they play endless sound bites of the president or of Elon Musk. And these are simple things that they could be reversing. Show the people who are being affected by the policies of the new government. Show the people who are fighting back, who are resigning in protest, or who are suffering. And it means it's a reverse of how organizations like the New York Times and the Washington Post have been operating, because they tend to look at the world from the power positions down. So to me, it feels like the press different parts of the press have already started to give in to the new government. And I think it's so essential that doesn't continue to happen, that gets reversed, and that people fight back, because the journalists are the first line of people who are telling truth to power. And the rest of us depend on them to not compromise on their job.
Rick, this has been a great conversation. Is there anything I haven't asked?
I've had a lot of people ask, what can we do? The first thing that I say is, first of all, that there are a lot of new news organizations on the local level. Don't get your news from one place. Don't rely on a newspaper that you might have relied on 10 or 20 years ago. So what do we have in this area? We have the San Francisco Public Press. We have Oakland side. We have Berkeley side. Your local public radio stations, of which there are many. Subscribe to them. Support them. On the national thing, I've started to listen to, I get a feed from Heather Cox Richardson. And then there's a fairly new news organization, the Contrarian. Jen Rubin, who was formerly of the Washington Post. Broaden where you go to get your news and discuss it with the people that you know. I think we just need more emphasis on supporting the local journalists and the local news organizations.
And before we close, I want to mention that there will be 3 Bay Area screenings of Stripped for Parts in March of 2025. First, there's a screening hosted by the San Francisco Public Press on Thursday, March 13th, at the Roxy in San Francisco, starting at 6 p.m. That same night, there will be a screening in Berkeley at the Hillside Club at 7 p.m., and then one on March 20th at the Smith-Raffel Film Center in San Rafael, starting at 7 p.m. Anyone interested in the public press event can find details on our website, sfpublicpress.org, and details for all 3 screenings are available at strippedforpartsfilm.com. KSFP is a project of the San Francisco Public Press, a nonprofit investigative newsroom. Find this episode, the companion article, and all our reporting at sfpublicpress.org. Civic comes to you from KSFP LP 102.5 FM in San Francisco, a project of the San Francisco Public Press. Our team includes producer Mel Baker and reporter Sylvie Sturm. I'm Lila LaHood. Thanks for listening.